The idea that pawn structure shapes strategy in a chess game is such an important one that I want to present a Grandmaster example to you now and try and show you how it all works with the framework of a top quality game. Playing white in this game is Grandmaster Bader Jobova. He's graded 2646, and playing black in this game is Mikhail Gurevich. This game comes from the Georgia-Turkey match, which was played in the Turin Olympiad back in 2006. And it's a great strategical achievement by white all the way through. The position becomes simplified. White obtains a superior pawn structure as a result of his opening play, and he simply takes it from there and wins the game in a clinical fashion. So let's see how this is done. The opening is a Queen's Gambit, Slav defence, which changes rapidly into the classical defence as black decides to play e6 here, blocking in the bishop on c8. Normally in this position, and this is far more thematic for the Slav defence, black would take on c4 and after a4 develop his bishop actively to f5. This is another variation, but when Gurevich plays e6, he's basically saying that he wants to keep it very tight in the opening stage of the game. Probably black is intending to put the bishop on c8 on b7. I mean, no grandmaster worth his salt would just block in a bishop in the opening just like that, because they know to immobilise a piece is foolish, especially against a top quality opponent. So black certainly has ideas for that bishop. He just doesn't block it in gratuitously. There are clear plans for that piece. Well, let's see what they are. The longer the game progresses, we will know what black is up to. White plays bishop g5, pinning the knight, and black plays knight bd7. Now white adds a slightly different twist to the game by taking on d5. He is fixing the pawn structure in the centre, and the idea is he just wants to play a nice coherent game by playing e3, bringing his bishop out to d3, and this is known as the exchange variation. Later on, white is hoping to assault black's pawn structure on the queen side with the help of what we call the minority attack. Minority attack basically describes a situation where one side or other attacks the majority pawns with a minority pawns. In this case, it's two pawns on b2 and 2 are going to assault the black pawn chain in order to try and create weaknesses there. Just taking play back, this was very good timing by white, because he's noted that the black knight has just gone to d7. Now the thing is that if black takes back with the c pawn in this position, he would much rather have this knight on c6. So to illustrate that point, just taking play back even further to bishop g5, let's say black had played bishop e7 in this position. Well, now taking on d5 wouldn't have the same effect, because after c takes d5, e3, black can bring his knight to the much more active square on c6. So going back to our game now, the capture on d5 was very good timing, and black captured back with the e pawn, e3, setting up the minority attack, bishop e7, getting out of the pin, and now both sides develop their pieces very logically over the next few moves. White brings his queen out, then he brings his bishop out, black brings his rook to a half open file, white castles, and now black drops his knight back to f8, giving the h7 square added reinforcement and letting the bishop on c8 come out into the game if that's what black wants. Okay, rook a b1. This is the first move which demonstrates clearly to us that pawn structure determines strategy in a game. White is definitely not putting the rook there for fun. Rooks are best placed in a chess game on open files or behind pawns that you want to push, and certainly white is now thinking about pushing this pawn to b4, possibly then on to b5, and then opening up the file for the rook by playing b takes c6. This is white's overall plan for the time being, and black has to find a good defence against it. Well, Gurevich decides to just develop his bishop to e6. This is reasonable. And after b4, he plays his rook to c8. So the rook on c8 is a peculiar move in the sense that the rook comes to a closed file, but black is anticipating white's idea of b5, and he certainly wants his rook on the same file as the white queen before b5 is played. So the net result of rook c8 is that white has got to be a little bit more careful preparing b5 than he otherwise would have to have been if black hadn't played rook c8, because white could have just gone through with b5 anyway. Well, white's got to do a little bit of preparation. So knight a4 was the move. I think the knight is perhaps heading for a nice outpost on c5. Black puts his knight in on e4, which is very common in this line, and now there is an exchange of pieces on e7. This slightly favours white in that he's weakened black's protection of the c5 square. So white is happy to put his knight in on c5 in the full knowledge that if black takes that knight, and I'm not sure that this is best for black, then the pawn structure changes and suddenly the white rook is in perfect position on the open file, coming down to attack the pawn on b7. In fact, this will be a very unfavourable position for black, because the b7 pawn is now down and white has a simple plan of perhaps doubling or even tripling his major pieces on the b file. So for instance, his ongoing plan would be something like rook b4, maybe rook f to b1, and then queen b2, queen b3, something like that. Black would have no counterplay to set against this scheme. So going back to knight c5, naturally Gurevich refrains from the exchange. He leaves the knight where it is, retreats his own knight to d6, which is a nice central square, and black might also be thinking about putting the knight in on c4 at some later date. a4. White continues with his overall plan of the minority attack. At some stage in this game, we're really looking forward to b5 from white, and hopefully then b takes c6, after which the black pawn structure becomes a little bit downgraded. So black's still trying to find counterplay against this scheme, and what Gurevich does is to try to take away one of white's best pieces by exchanging it off the board. Bishop f5. All black wants is to get this dangerous bishop on d3 off the board. Okay, well, white can't really avoid the exchange in this position, and black recaptures with the knight. White goes queen b3, and black puts his knight back on d6. So now we see the positional point of Gurevich's idea of exchanging the light square bishops. He now intends to put his knight on c4, and as there's no light square bishop on the board, white has to work quite hard to exchange off this powerful knight. Alright, on with the show. b5. This is white's overall plan, and I've no doubt at all Jobova was quite happy to execute it. And Gurevich went knight c4. Fair enough. Just dropping back. Now obviously black can take on b5 in this position, but let's take a look at the consequences of this move. The problem with this capture is that black now has a very weak isolated pawn on d5. Isolated pawns are definitely things to avoid in your games, especially as the endgame approaches. Isolated pawns have a tendency to become much weaker the more pieces are exchanged off the board. With a lot of pieces on the board, many attacking players are happy to accept isolated queen's pawn positions. We're going to take a little look at these types of positions a bit later on, because there's a lot of freedom of movement associated with the squares around the isolated pawn. However, here, in a simplified situation, the pawn on a d5 is simply plain weak. So white could go on naturally with a takes b5, and now black is left contemplating this weakness on d5, which he's going to have for the rest of the game, and which he's got no way to resolve. So this will just give him a major disadvantage without any compensation whatsoever. Which is why Gurevich plonks his knight in on c4. At least now, white is downgrading black's pawns, but black has a strongly placed knight. Well, now I think white starts to play very strongly. Let's take a look at this position in terms of pawn islands. Now you'll know already that pawn islands are groups of pawns. In general, the player with fewer pawn islands can look forward to the better endgame. Here, white has two pawn islands. The pawn on a4 is isolated, it's a little pawn island of its own, and then he's got this pawn chain stretching from d4 to h2, which is his second pawn island. Meanwhile, black has three pawn islands. He's got the pawn on a7, the pawns on c6 and d5, and pawns on f7 g6 and h7. This means that probably black's endgame prospects are worse in this position. So whatever black does, he's got to be very careful he doesn't completely simplify down to an endgame where white simply has the much better pawn structure and can look forward to picking the weak pawns off. Pawn islands are associated with pawn weaknesses. The more pawn islands you have, the more pawn weaknesses you are inheriting. So take note of that in your own games. Well, okay, Jobova plays queen to c3. He's perhaps thinking now of rook to b7, infiltrating, which is why Gurevich stops him straight away with rook b8. White has the superior endgame prospects thanks to his 2 pawn islands versus 3 here, so Jobova is happy to exchange. Again, this is perhaps a move which a lot of club players would shy away from. They don't like simplified positions very much, but here this is simply a good move by White. He's exchanging off black's most strongly placed piece, and he's just looking forward to the better endgame. Black can hardly avoid the exchange, and now Gurevich offers yet another exchange, which White gladly accepts. And we now reach a pure major piece endgame, where once again you have to say that White has slightly the better prospects. Whether this should be a completely losing position for black or not, I don't really know. I think Gurevich, and he's a very strong grandmaster who has been, fighting for the World Championship 10-20 years ago, he obviously felt that he could hold this endgame. But, well, Jobova makes chess look a very simple game from here on in. His first task is to safety the king. So White plays h3. I mean, White's advantage in this position is not going to go away. As I say, black's main problem is his pawn island situation and the fact that the pawn on c6 is backward, trapped on a half-open file, and subject to attack at any stage by White. Meanwhile, black has no counterplay. Black's got to sit and wait, and this is the most unpleasant fate in chess. So queen d6 was played. White plays queen c2, training in on the c6 pawn. Therefore, black exchanges, and rook c8 was played. But now White really starts to warm up with rook b7. Major piece positions depend on activity. So not only does White have the better endgame here, thanks to his superior pawn formation, he is now getting more active than black. And this is really why black is in trouble in this situation. Black has been forced to make a series of purely defensive moves. And despite the incredible simplification here, black is even being offered the exchange of rooks here. It's going to be very difficult to hold this endgame for black because he's not active. He's passive. And this makes life extremely difficult. However, as I say, Gurevich probably felt he could hold this. He played queen d8. Rook came back to b3, just waiting. Typical grandmaster tactics. It's like torture technique. You don't clarify the position. You're better. The advantage is not going to go away, so you just make a quiet move and force black to continue to find uncomfortable defensive moves. Just going back, obviously White could have tried rook b8 in this situation. Then I suppose black would defend himself after rook c8. White could trade. But then the problem for White is the move he really wants to play in this situation is queen b7. But he can't. So I guess this is why Jobova retreats. And Jobova's plan now is essentially to perhaps play rook c3 and nail down that pawn on c6 once again. So this is why Gurevich seizes the opportunity to break free. Okay, d takes c5. Rook takes c5. It's still 2 pawn islands versus 1, and the pawn on d5 is isolated and weak as described before. However, black has slightly more freedom of action, and this is obviously what Gurevich was hoping. The added freedom of action given to him by liberating the rook on c7 would enable him to draw this endgame. Queen e5. Tactical ideas crop up even in simplified positions. The queen pins the pawn on d5 and threatens rook b8. And this time rook b8 will win a pawn, I think. For instance, if black plays some random move like h5 here, then I think rook b8, rook c8 forced, and now rook takes c8, queen takes c8, queen takes d5. I think, is a clear pawn up for white. There's no counterplay to be found in queen c1 check. We now see the usefulness of that move h3 played earlier on. And after queen to c7, you know, white has easy defensive moves, let's say even with f4. And white can continue to inch forward in this endgame. Going back to queen e5, black therefore decided to play rook c1 check, perhaps nudging the king to a slightly more precarious square and away from the centre. So a useful little game for black. And then black dropped his rook back to c8. Now white starts to train in on the weaknesses. Rook b5. And around here I think black probably started thinking to himself, well, this might be lost. It's difficult for me now. I'm going to lose a pawn, and I haven't really got any compensation for it. Well, what Gurevich does is to bail out into a rook endgame and hope that he can draw it. The isolated pawn goes west. Black plays queen c7. Off come the queens, and now king g3. Some bright spark a long time ago said that all rook endgames are drawn. Well, that's very funny. This one, I am not sure whether it's drawn or not. It's certainly extremely uncomfortable for black. Okay, it's 2 pawn islands each now, but you know, only white can win. And when you get into a situation where the best you can hope for is a draw, this is one of the most miserable fates in chess. But Gurevich is a very tough player. You know, he's not going to give in. This is not a resignable situation. So he carries on with rook c6, and black's main task in the rest of this endgame is to sit tight and wait, and to avoid creating further weaknesses. This is the main task of the defender. This is why defence is so difficult. You know, you've got this thankless task of doing nothing for the rest of the game, and really all you can do is to avoid making your position worse. In practice, a lot of players lash out in a situation like this, and well, just crumple to defeat very quickly. But as you'll see, black manages to put up heroic defence in this endgame, only failing right at the end. So rook c6 was played. White played rook a5 to encourage the black pawn forward, and now white played h4. The kings came up. In the endgame, the king is a strong piece. Moved the king actively and aggressively towards the centre. There was a check, a probing check, and the king went back. And now black plays rook c6, asking white, are you making progress or not? Rook came to d5. Black played rook c4. This forces white to play rook d4, and now black plays rook c5. I think if black exchanges rooks in this situation, the pawn ending is a simple win for white. The passed pawn is going to tie black down, and then probably the white king will infiltrate decisively on the king side, whilst the black king is forced to look after the pawn on d4. So rook comes to c5, rook f4. Basically, there's no rush in an endgame situation like this. Any advantage that white has is not going to go away, and white can make progress at his leisure. It's a most uncomfortable situation for black. In the end, the winning technique comes to the same. The idea is that white creates a passed pawn and pushes that passed pawn forward, tying the enemy down completely, and organises a decisive infiltration after that. I mean, I think in this endgame the process is lengthy, but it is very viable. Black tries to keep his rook as active as he can. King comes to e4. Rook comes to a2. King goes to f3. Pawn comes up to a5. Rook e4 check. It's all about passed pawns. We're waiting to see whether white can create a passed pawn in this endgame. Obviously, he's going to try and do it on the king side. King comes to d5. Rook f4. Thing about these endgames, and king e6 I think is the best move by black, is that any pawn advance that black makes in this position is going to weaken his position. So this is why, for instance, Gurevich refrains from a move like f5. This just gives white more to bite on in the endgame. And, well, I mean, a good plan for white would be to organise a king infiltration here, perhaps king coming up to g5 at some point. So black decides to play king e6 in the game. Alright, g4. Black exchanges, and white takes back with the king. We're still looking for white to create that passed pawn. Gurevich continues to keep things tight. King G3, King E7, nothing too much going on here. There's a check, and now Rook C4. Black continues to do nothing, and now here's the first sign that White is thinking about that passed pawn. He inches forward with F3 and then E4. So White's plan is probably something like F4 and then either E5 or F5. Either of these advances will create a passed pawn, whether it be the E pawn or the H pawn. We don't know quite yet. But that's White's overall plan. King H6. Rook comes to D4 and there's a check. King F2. Rook H1. And now, finally, White starts to think about his passed pawn, but surprisingly, it's going to be the pawn on the A file that becomes passed. I think this happened because Black's rook drifted offside. Black lost a little bit of patience in this endgame, or maybe he couldn't see any defence to White's idea of F4 and E5. So he decided to keep as active as possible. But of course, what's happened here now is that suddenly White has his passed pawn. The Black king is a long way away from that passed pawn, and this makes the rest of the game very easy to understand. White just organises the advance of that passed pawn, and Black can't really do very much about it. Up comes the pawn to A5. Black's getting a bit desperate here. Suddenly there are two passed pawns. Of course, Black now has the opportunity to get his rook back into the game. Rook comes to A8. Black puts his rook in behind the passed pawn. When you're defending, you want your rook behind the passed pawn. Fair enough. A6. There's a check. King comes to G3. Rook A3, and now A7 is the winning move. Black resigned. Why does he resign? Well, the problem is that White is threatening rook to H8, after which a skewer will become inevitable. Black needs his king on G7 in a position like this, and he probably doesn't need the white pawn on E5. The fact is that if Black goes King F7 here, then the win is easy after rook H8. Rook takes A7, rook H7 check, winning the rook. And if we go back to the position after A7, I don't think Black can do a single thing about this idea. If he goes King E6, it's even easier. Rook E8 check, and once again, the pawn promotes on the next move. So that was a very instructive game in all its phases, a game in which pawn structure determined strategy throughout. It was in many ways a masterpiece by Jobova, and a perfect demonstration of how a top-class grandmaster prevents counterplay throughout an extremely long game.